would not be the same. Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. I suppose we all thought that, one way or another.
On the 6th and 9th of August 1945, the world bore witness to a new type of warfare. The nuclear bombs, Little Boy and Fat Man, were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki by American bombers. The goal was to force Imperial Japan to surrender, which they did on the 15th of August 1945. It is widely known that the dropping of these two new types of weapons brought to an end the bloodiest conflict in human history, with a death toll of well over 70 million. But in today's video, we will cover just what happened in the days, weeks and months following the dropping of the weapon that would go on to shape the remainder of the 20th century. Hiroshima was the first city selected to be destroyed by the atomic bomb. It was selected as it was vital for both manufacturing and military command. It also housed the headquarters for Field Marshal Shunraku Hatta. It was also home to approximately 350,000 people, many living in tightly packed wooden-roofed houses, though the central area of Hiroshima consisted largely of concrete buildings. Nagasaki was selected as the second target for its shipyards, steelworks, and manufacturing centers. Almost all of the workforce of Nagasaki were employed in some form of manufacturing. Unlike Hiroshima, most of the buildings and homes were of wooden construction, again tightly packed. Around 260 people were thought to have been in Nagasaki at the time of the bombing. On the 6th of August 1945, a modified Boeing B-29 Superfortress, given the moniker Enola Gay, flew over Hiroshima in the early morning. The Little Boy bomb was delivered by parachute at 8:15 in the morning. It was detonated around 2,000 feet above Hiroshima. The resulting blast was equivalent of around 12 to 15,000 tons of TNT. And this was with just 2% of the bomb's uranium achieving fission. At least 80,000 men, women and children died instantly. Over the next few days, the Japanese government reeled from the destruction of Hiroshima. Some considered the surrender proposed known as the Potsdam Declaration. Last-ditch efforts to avoid the Soviet Union declaring war on Japan were made, all of which failed, leaving Japan with the warning that on the 9th of August the Soviet Union would declare war. Leaflets were dropped by American bombers onto a number of Japanese cities, though not onto Nagasaki. On the morning of the 9th of August, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and began its invasion of Manchuria. The Japanese government met in Tokyo to discuss proposing their conditional surrender. At this point, however, the modified B-29 bomber known as Boxcar was flying over Nagasaki. Much like the first bomb, the Fat Man nuclear bomb detonated some 1,600 feet over the city of Nagasaki. Anywhere from 40,000 to 75,000 men, women and children were instantly killed. The next day, on the 10th of August, Japanese civilian and military leadership met to discuss whether or not they would agree to the full and unconditional surrender as set out by the Potsdam Declaration. Emperor Hirohito, breaking the tradition of the emperor not meddling in government decisions, declares that he wants to accept the Potsdam Declaration, but only if the title of emperor can remain sovereign. Meanwhile, plans for further nuclear strikes are planned by the Americans. That is, until Japanese media broadcasts leak that Japan intends to unconditionally surrender. American Secretary of State James Burns issues his response to Emperor Hirohito's request that he remains in power. Burns' response is that it will be the Allied powers who will be in control and will in due course allow the Japanese people to decide their own form of governance. With the uncertainty of his position, Hirohito pushes his government to surrender. A failed military coup later, Japan formally surrenders on the 15th of August 1945, bringing an end to the bloodiest conflict in human history. But it is vital to take into account what happened to those people directly impacted by the nuclear bombs in the seconds, days, and years later. Within the first seconds of the bomb detonating, extreme infrared energy was released and instantly burned exposed skin for miles. The soft internal organs of all life evaporated. Neutrons and gamma rays start to hit the ground within the first few milliseconds of the blast. The ionizing radiation that will claim many lives in the days to come. The blast wave spread outward at speeds reaching 7,000 miles per hour, driving a fireball that would consume much of the city's buildings. At the center of the explosion, temperatures would reach 7,000 Fahrenheit. Broken glass and all manner of debris is sent flying, cutting through those unfortunate enough to be caught up in the deadly tempest. The telltale gigantic mushroom cloud forms visible for miles. With such a destructive force, it is no wonder that between the two bombs, some 150,000 people died instantly. What made matters worse is that the doctors, nurses, and medical staff were largely wiped out by the blasts. It is estimated that 90% of the doctors in Hiroshima were instantly killed or injured, with only 3 of the 45 hospitals unaffected. This only exacerbated the crisis that would follow the detonation. Whilst the initial blasts claimed tens of thousands of lives in an instant, the slower, more insidious deaths were still to come. By the 4th day, those who had been treated for apparent burns started to display some unusual symptoms. Purple spots appeared all over the affected person's body. They would begin to hemorrhage blood after the smallest of cuts or injections and vomit a foul brown liquid. Hair would fall out in clumps at the slightest of touches as necrosis set in. At the time, doctors had no idea that they were dealing with radiation sickness, an incurable condition that affected those closest to the center of the blast or those who had consumed irradiated material. Many had consumed water from nearby rivers, driven to do so from the intense heat caused by the blast, unaware of the contamination. And what is most disturbing is that some attempted to drink the oily black rain from the mushroom cloud, though they soon realized it was the atomized remains of the city and people who were once around them. The heat and light from the nuclear bombs were of such intensity that they burned patterns from clothing directly onto the victim's skin. Superheated wristwatches became branding implements for those who wore them too close to the hypercenter of the blast. For those who looked directly into the initial intense flash of the nuclear strike, they were left with instant and permanent blindness. For others, cataracts and blindness would follow in a few short years. Though perhaps the most infamous injury associated with the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki are that of the so-called ant-walking alligator people. The term derives from the now discredited book The Last Train from Hiroshima. According to the eyewitness testimonies compiled by the book, they were now eyeless and faceless, with their heads transformed into blackened alligator hides displaying red holes indicating mouths. The alligator people did not scream. Their mouths could not form the sounds. The noise they made was worse than screaming. They uttered a continuous murmur, like locusts on a midsummer night. One man staggering on charred stumps of legs was carrying a dead baby upside down. It is important to note that this book was pulled by the publisher due to fabrication of sources. It is, however, likely that many people were badly burned, dying an incredibly painful death as their very flesh melted. Over the next 2 to 4 months, the effects of the bombs killed between 90,000 to 146,000 people in Hiroshima and 39 to 80,000 people in Nagasaki. For months afterward, many people continue to die from the effects of severe burns, radiation sickness, and all manner of injuries caused by the blasts. All of this made worse by the dire conditions, with illness running rampant and a lack of food causing malnutrition. It is important to remember that a great number of forced Korean labourers were in both cities. It is also impossible to know just how many families were entirely wiped out, leaving no one to report the deaths. Health problems did not end after a few months. Pregnant women exposed to the bombings experienced higher rates of miscarriages and deaths among their infants. Those who were able to give birth had children who were more likely to have intellectual disabilities, impaired growth, as well as an increased risk of developing cancers. This can be seen in the increase in leukemia cases. Leukemia cases rose around 2 years following the blasts and would remain high for around 6 years, mainly affecting young children. It is thought that the effects of the bombs increased leukemia instances by almost 50%. By the mid-1950s, other forms of cancers started to rise. Thyroid, breast, and lung cancers all spiked. There are even reports of those unlucky or lucky, depending on how you view it, to have survived both of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The first to be recognized as a dual survivor was Tatamao Yamaguchi. Yamaguchi was on a business trip to Hiroshima for his company, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. He was caught up in the first nuclear blast. He was approximately 3 kilometers away from the blast and was left with radiation burns to the top left side of his body. He then returned to his home city of Nagasaki, where he received treatment for the burns, and returned to work on the 9th of August. This time he was unhurt by the blast, but would suffer from an infection due to unchanged bandages. Yamaguchi went on to live a long life, passing away at the age of 93. To this day, there have only been the bombings at Hiroshima and Nagasaki that represent the only uses of nuclear bombs against a population. This is not a video discussing whether or not the bombs were justified. This is just a video examining the human cost of employing such devices. In the years that have followed, nuclear bombs have proliferated and grown even more powerful. The destructive capabilities held by only a few countries pose a danger that is all too well known during the Cold War. Yet, following the cooling of the Cold War, there have only been a few instances of a real chance of a nuclear strike. The horrors inflicted on Hiroshima and Nagasaki are beyond comprehension, as is the human toll. We can only hope that Hiroshima and Nagasaki remain the only 2 cities to face a nuclear strike.